On a cold September night in 1327, the peaceful countryside of Gloucestershire was shattered by terrifying cries. Villagers near Berkeley Castle jolted awake, swearing they heard screams so piercing, so agonized, they claimed no human could produce them unless enduring the most unspeakable torment. These cries, history tells us, belonged to none other than Edward II, former King of England, a monarch betrayed, imprisoned, and, if legend is to be believed, murdered in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. But was Edward II truly killed that night? Or does the truth lie hidden behind centuries of political intrigue, propaganda, and rumor? Tonight, we uncover the dark fate of Edward II and the mystery that still haunts England's history. Edward of Carnarvon was born in 1284, the fourth son of King Edward I, known to history as Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Few expected young Edward to inherit the throne, but the untimely deaths of his older brothers thrust him into the direct line of succession. From the start, Edward II stood in stark contrast to his iron-fisted father. Where Edward I was a warrior king, towering, disciplined, and ruthless, his son was softer, more carefree, and drawn to pursuits considered unbecoming of a future monarch. He loved music, theatre, and rustic manual labor, reportedly finding joy in digging ditches and thatching roofs alongside commoners. To his father, this behavior was disgraceful, a sign of weakness in a world where kings were expected to command armies and conquer territories. Yet, when Edward I died in 1307, the 23-year-old Edward II inherited not only the crown of England, but also the immense pressures of ruling a kingdom embroiled in war, debt, and bitter aristocratic rivalries. Central to Edward's reign was one man, Piers Gaveston, a charming Gascon knight of questionable background. Gaveston became Edward's closest companion, and, according to some chronicles, his lover. Their bond was so deep that Edward lavished titles, lands, and wealth upon Gaveston, sparking fury among England's barons. The nobility despised him, calling him arrogant, reckless, and dangerously influential over the young king. Matters reached a boiling point when Edward appointed Gaveston as regent of England during his own absence in France. To the barons, this was intolerable. In 1312, Gaveston was captured by Edward's enemies and brutally executed. Edward was devastated. Chroniclers describe the king as inconsolable, mourning Gaveston with a grief that seemed to eclipse even the duties of kingship. The seeds of discontent between Edward and his nobles had now grown into outright hostility. Isabella of France, often remembered as the she-wolf, was no passive consort. Daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, she grew increasingly resentful of Edward's neglect and his devotion to the Despensers. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France on a diplomatic mission and refused to return. Instead, she allied with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman and her rumored lover. Together, they plotted Edward's downfall. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army. To Edward's shock, the invasion met little resistance. His own barons, long alienated, defected to Isabella's side. Within weeks, Edward's power collapsed. He fled with the Despensers, but was soon captured. Hugh Despenser suffered a horrific execution, and Edward, once King of England, was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. The former king was now a prisoner in his own realm, the prisoner of Berkeley Castle. Edward II's captivity began in Kenilworth Castle but soon shifted to the grim fortress of Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Here, under the watchful eyes of Mortimer and Isabella's loyalists, Edward languished in isolation. Accounts describe his treatment as harsh, designed to break both body and spirit. His captors reportedly subjected him to neglect, deprivation, and even psychological torment, like housing him above rotting animal carcasses so the stench would make his confinement unbearable. But the world outside had not forgotten Edward. Rumors swirled of plots to free him, and rebellions threatened Isabella and Mortimer's fragile hold on power. The longer Edward lived, the greater the danger, the screams in the night. And so came that night in September 1327. Chronicles report that villagers near Berkeley Castle awoke to ghastly screams echoing through the darkness. Some said the cries were so horrifying that they never forgot them for the rest of their lives. According to the most infamous account, Edward II was murdered in a manner so grotesque it became legend. A red hot poker thrust into his body through a horn to avoid external marks of violence. It was said to be both a punishment and a cruel mockery of his rumored relationships with men. Yet, even in medieval times, some doubted the story. Could such a horrific method truly have been used? Or was it propaganda crafted to vilify Isabella and Mortimer? What is certain is this: by morning, Edward II was dead. He was just 43 years old. Aftermath and political fallout. Edward's death paved the way for Isabella and Mortimer to rule as regents for young Edward III. But their triumph was short-lived. Their ruthless grip on power alienated many. And in 1330, Edward III overthrew Mortimer, had him executed, and placed his mother under house arrest. The official story was clear. Edward II had died at Berkeley Castle in 1327. But whispers persisted. Did Edward II survive? Historians have long debated Edward's fate. Some evidence suggests he may have survived. A letter known as the Fieschi Letter, written by an Italian cleric, claimed Edward escaped captivity and lived as a hermit in Europe. Others point to suspicious gaps in records and conflicting accounts of his death. Was the tale of the red-hot poker an invention to justify Isabella and Mortimer's rule? Did Edward live out his final years in obscurity, far from the throne that once defined him? The mystery endures. Nearly 700 years later, the legacy of Edward II. Edward II remains one of England's most tragic monarchs, a man unsuited to the brutal demands of kingship, remembered more for scandal, favoritism, and failure than for governance. Yet his story captivates us because it lies at the intersection of power, betrayal, and humanity. Was he a weak king undone by love and poor judgment? Or was he a victim of political forces too great to resist? Perhaps both. What is certain is this: on that September night, screams echoed across Berkeley Castle, and whether they came from Edward's final torment or from the echo chamber of rumour and fear, they haunt history to this day. The brutal fate of Edward II remains one of England's darkest historical enigmas. A king who lost everything: his crown, his freedom, and perhaps his life, to the relentless forces of power and betrayal. And though centuries have passed, the chilling question still lingers: what truly happened inside Berkeley Castle that night?